It was a war that Russia thought it would easily win. Ukraine would crumble under Russia's sheer military might, Putin told his people. It didn't, and now the unthinkable is happening in Russia. Members of Russia's regional parliament are admitting that the war is lost. Panic reigns and chaos follows, as officials are claiming that a war that has eclipsed World War II is now a war from which Putin has to cut and run. The dissenting voices are getting louder, and one of those voices belongs to Grigory Yeremeyev. At 69 years old, Yeramayv has seen almost all of what Putin has seen in Russia. He watched during the glory days of the Soviet Union as Russia ruled an empire that Putin is now so desperate to restore. Yeramayv was there when the Soviet Union collapsed and Russia was forced to rebuild. Putin's rise to power also happened under this politician's gaze, and now, after 4 years of fighting in Ukraine, Yeramayv has delivered a powerful message to Russia's leader and his own parliamentary colleague: admit that the Ukraine war has failed to achieve any of the strategic goals that Putin set. In a short while, we'll get to the evidence that proves Yeramayv is right, as well as look at why Ukraine is now worse for Russia than World War II in many ways. But before we do, a close look at Yeramayev's statements is needed. According to RFU News on February 5th, the Russian politician stood before his colleagues to state that the goals of the Ukraine war have not only not been obtained, but that they are now fundamentally unobtainable. In other words, Russia can't win. And as for Putin, he is only continuing the war because stopping it would mean that he goes down in history as a defeated president who lost to a nation that nobody thought could stand up to Russia's aggression. To say that these are controversial comments is an understatement. As Amnesty International points out, people who peacefully protest Putin's war often face trumped-up charges as the Kremlin tries to silence their voices. False claims of violence against police are often made. Putin can't pull that one against a member of a parliament who has spoken in the parliament building. But the Kremlin can claim incitement to hatred, as it often does against anti-war voices. It may even go so far as to say that Yeramayv is treasonous because he has dared to speak out about Putin. But these charges won't change the symbolic power of what Yeramayv did. He stood in front of his colleagues, many of whom are desperate for even a shred of Putin's attention, and revealed the reality that they're all trying to hide from their own president. We would love to tell you that Yeramayev's words inspired a rebellion, that those in the Russian parliament who agreed with him rose up as one and showed their spines by declaring Putin's preposterous war a failure. But sadly, that didn't happen. Predictably, the so-called politicians, or more accurately, career climbers who are trying to make their noses as brown as possible to make Putin happy, chose to shut Yeramayv down. Almost as soon as Yeramayv started talking, other deputies began to shout him down. His microphone was covered and then cut, in a desperate showcase of the Kremlin's desire to control a narrative that the politician was in the process of shattering. This isn't politics, it's power. Putrid effort by politicians who are more concerned with Putin's opinions than with his failures, all trying to shut down a dissenting voice that was telling them the truth. But they didn't act fast enough. The voice still spoke, and it said words that many in Russia, likely including the performative shills in the Russian parliament who decried Yeramayv, agree with. Putin's war has been a failure, and it continues to be so. And all that Putin can do now is keep the war going, as changing course now does precisely what Yeramayv says, casts Putin as the beaten president in a war that he started. Yeramayv has been punished for his transgression. According to RFU News, the politician was charged with abusing press freedoms in the wake of his statement, which is a move so ridiculous that it's laughable. Press freedoms. In a country where social media platforms like Telegram are being shut down precisely because they offer the press the opportunity to tell the Russian people what is really happening in Ukraine, press freedom doesn't exist in a political system wherein expressing even a small doubt about Putin's campaign is tantamount to treason. Yeramayv appears to have gotten off lightly, at least for now. A court in Samara, which is the region where the politician's speech took place, has fined Yeramayv 30,000 rubles, or around $388, for his remarks. The Russian election monitor X account also provides more details, noting that Yeramayev's speech happened in the Samara Regional Duma, and that Yeramayv even said that Putin himself knows that the Ukraine invasion is a failure and was a mistake. The words of this brave dissident were also enough to trigger 7 whole minutes of furious debate. Russia's regional aspect outlet adds that the politician has always been something of a rebel, and he was even brave enough to call Putin's war the grinding of human lives and destinies. This was no meek criticism aimed at those around Putin. Yeramayev's words were a direct shot at Russia's leader, a statement that demonstrates how Putin, no matter how many laws he puts in place, can never silence those who oppose him. A prison sentence may soon follow for Yeramayv, regional aspect says. But if that's the price that he pays for declaring that propaganda lies and the daily murders of hundreds of civilians in Ukraine were becoming commonplace, then it appears that he is glad to pay it. Yeramayv would have known about the backlash that his words would spark, but in saying them, he has exposed Putin as the fraud that he is, and Yeramayv is 100% right about everything. Later in the video, we're going to dig deeper into the politician's claims that Putin is now trapped by the very war that he started, meaning he can no longer stop, though he also can't win. Before we cover that, let's explore the claims that Putin has failed to achieve his strategic objectives and he has no hopes of doing so in the future. And it seems that the logical starting point for that discussion is something that RFU News notes in its report on Yeramayev's comments. Ukraine is the worst war for Russia since World War II, and in many ways, it surpasses that horrifying war. The Ukraine war has certainly lasted longer than Russia's involvement in World War II. As Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty reported, January 12th marked the point where the Soviet war against Adolf Hitler's forces had been officially eclipsed in length by the so-called special military operation. 3 years, 10 months, and 8 days was the magic time period, and every day that has followed since only adds to a failure from which Putin can't hide. He dragged his country into a fight that has failed to win anywhere near as quickly as Putin claimed it would. For every day that now passes, Russia is losing an average of 1,000 soldiers to a fight that, by the Kremlin's initial account, should have been long won. It gets worse on the World War II front for Russia. Though the Soviet war against the Nazis contains some of the most brutal battles in history, meaning that Russia's losses in Ukraine haven't eclipsed those in World War II, Putin has a lot less to show for his brutal war than his Soviet ancestors achieved with their defense against Hitler. As RFU News reports, Ukraine's drones fly as deep as 1,500 kilometers or 932 miles into Russian territory. Of course, drones weren't a problem for the Soviet Union during World War II, but what we see there is that Russia is absorbing attacks on its own turf, even well after the point where the Ukraine war has outlasted World War II. By this point, the Soviets had won against the Nazi invaders. Attacks inside Russia weren't a concern, but they still are in the Ukraine war, and it's all Putin's fault. The Ukraine war has also eclipsed Russia's World War II campaign in terms of the sheer failure of Putin's forces to capture territory. By the end of World War II, the Soviet Union had managed to push the Nazis between 1,500 and 1,800 kilometers, or 932 to 1,118 miles west, leading to Russia's arrival in Berlin. However, in Ukraine, Russia's advances only go as deep as 150 kilometers, or 93 miles into Ukraine at the very best. It has taken Putin longer than the Soviets fought against the Nazis to take a tenth of the territory, and he achieved this failure even though he had the advantage of kicking off the so-called special military operation at the Ukrainian border. Putin holds the Soviet campaign during World War II up as a crusade that saved the entire world. In Ukraine, he has created a campaign that will crumble Russia. None of Putin's goals has been achieved, and according to Finland's president Alexander Stubb, Putin has already suffered a strategic defeat so massive that he will inevitably go down in history as a failure. Speaking at the Munich Security Conference on February 13th, Stubb laid out every failed goal. He wanted to make Ukraine Russian, it became European, Stubb said, failure number 1. He wanted to prevent the enlargement of NATO, he got Finland and Sweden, failure number 2. And he wanted to keep our defense expenditure down, and now it's up to 5%, failure number 3. When listed out like that, you could argue that Yeramayev's words in the Samara Regional Duma were charitable. The Ukraine war is absolutely lost for Russia, as everything that Putin wanted to achieve, including and outside of stripping Ukraine of its sovereign status, has been botched to such a serious degree that it's honestly surprising that there aren't more like Yeramayv who are calling him out. Russia's strategic defeat is compounded by its failure to dominate in any area of the Ukraine war. For Putin, that lack of domination could be used as leverage against Russia in peace negotiations, according to Canada's Policy magazine. Russia has been reduced to falsely claiming the capture of cities that still stand, as it did with Kupiansk in late 2025. It has become increasingly clear that the narrative that Russia's forces push forward as Ukrainians take shelter, which the magazine says has pervaded Western media, is simply false. Ukraine's defense isn't futile, it's successful. The Nazis fell faster and harder to the Soviet advance than Ukraine is falling to Putin's, and that's being charitable again. At best, Ukraine, from a strategic perspective, has experienced a few stumbles as Putin pours everything that his country has into the fight that he's failing to win. If we regularly heard about the thousands of Russian soldiers killed as they push forward Putin's imperial fantasies, more of us would reflect on the high cost of each inch gained. More of us would see the aggressor's willingness to pay it as desperation rather than a sign of Russia's inevitable success. Policy magazine says of what the Western media should be reporting more frequently. It's these kind of failures that Yeramayv was pointing to when he made his speech, and there's no denying that he said it. Let's come back to the territory issue for a minute. We've already touched on how bad Russia's Ukraine advance has been in comparison to what the country achieved against what was once the most powerful military nation on the planet. According to the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, Russia has now reached the point where its recruitment is struggling to keep pace with its losses. The Kremlin hired 406,000 people to fight in Ukraine in 2025, but ISW says that casualty estimates exceed 410,000. For all of this death, Russia has actually managed to lose territory in Ukraine. It grabbed 26% of the country, including the previously illegally annexed region of Crimea that it already held in March 2022. But rather than setting the stage for a push forward, 26% is the best that Russia could manage. 4 years and over 1.25 million casualties later, Russia holds just over 20% of Ukraine, and its slow advance is killing the Kremlin's propaganda. It could take years for Russia to get back to 26%, and there would still be more than 3/4 of Ukraine to go. That is an embarrassment to Putin. A failure so massive that it doesn't matter how many cries of treason try to silence the voices of people like Yeramayv. It's all there in the facts. Putin has blundered his way into ruining whatever legacy he had before Ukraine. The Kremlin's excuses have all run out. That's why politicians are now openly calling for the end of Putin's war. Not even the pro-war analysts in Russia, such as the military bloggers upon whom Putin has relied to peddle his narrative, can be trusted anymore. They're being labelled as foreign agents, much like some called for Yeramayv to be labelled, as they're criticizing battlefield realities, commanders and decisions, exposing divisions among those who are supposed to sustain public morale for the war effort, RFU News states. And to combat all of this misery, Putin isn't even getting what he wants from the peace talks that he thought he could manipulate to push Ukraine into handing over the Donbass region. That would have been at least something for Russia's president. Sure, all of his other strategic goals have fallen by the wayside and seem further away than ever, but claiming the Donbass would be enough for him to claim some small measure of success. But that's not happening either. As Politico noted in a February 13th article, the peace talks are now bogged down. Russia hasn't been able to convince the US to lean on Ukraine heavily enough to convince Zelensky to cede the Donbass, which leaves Russia with no choice but to keep on fighting a war that has eclipsed World War II and has been a failure on every single level. This is a war that puts more financial strain on Russia with each day that passes without victory, which is yet another of Putin's failures. Taking Ukraine should have enriched Russia. The country, the Ukrainian Geologic Survey claims, is home to $15 trillion of mineral resources, representing a staggering 5% of the world's total mineral wealth. Putin wanted that money. What he has after 4 years is a version of Russia that is in a financial crisis. The country's economy is stagnating, as spending on healthcare, education, economic infrastructure, law enforcement and welfare has all collapsed, as Russia pushes yet more of its budget into the Ukraine war and the repayment of debt. The International Monetary Fund predicts that the Russian economy will grow just 0.8% in 2026, following a stagnant 2025 that saw just 0.6% growth. Russia is selling its oil at vast discounts just to keep some money coming in, and it faces long-term population pressures, to which the sheer scale of death in Ukraine is only adding. Yeramayv is right. Russia has already lost the Ukraine war. And he was right about another thing. Putin can't stop now, because doing so would mean admitting that loss and going down in history as a complete and utter failure. Putin is now trapped. Peter Dickinson said as much in a February 12th piece for the Atlantic Council, where he pointed out that Putin's goal, perhaps above everything else he aims to achieve in Ukraine, is to secure his legacy. Putin genuinely believes he is on a historic mission to reverse the injustice of the Soviet collapse and revive the Russian Empire. In order to achieve this, he has convinced himself that he must erase Ukraine as a state and as a nation, Dickinson writes. This obsession has shaped everything that Putin does, and it's led him into the no-win situation that he now faces, Dickinson argues. Yeramayv sees all of this. As we said at the beginning of the video, the politician is old enough to have watched everything that Putin has done in over a quarter of a century of rule, and he sees through the strongman facade. Putin is now continuing the Ukraine war to delay the day of reckoning that he faces for his failures, perhaps to the point where he believes that he may be dead before that day comes. Everything he has tried to do has empowered Ukraine, along with Europe and NATO, as his control over his people slips. The internal propaganda that Putin has used in Ukraine is collapsing around him. Putin has been reduced to sending out false flags, such as a claim that Ukraine targeted one of his residences that was almost certainly faked, to maintain the illusion that Ukraine is getting desperate. But it's Putin himself who is now just hanging on to survive. He has sold his own country out to China just to maintain power. As the European Union Institute for Security Studies notes, there is now a massive dependence gap between China and Russia, and it's Russia that is on the wrong side of the gap. Again, that's the fault of Putin and his misconceived war. China could ruin Russia by, for example, refusing to buy Russian oil if it gets a better deal elsewhere, and it could very well do that, especially as new sanctions are placing pressure on Beijing to cut and run from Russia. China adjusts its behavior when support would entail substantial economic pain, the institute says. Putin's only answer to that is greater subservience to China, which in turn weakens Russia, even beyond the catastrophic damage done by the failed Ukraine war. Now, loss is looming for Putin. Loss in Ukraine, even beyond what Russia has experienced so far. Loss of control over Russia and its future as China circles like a shark and Putin gives up everything to stay in power. And the loss of the very people who are supposed to peddle the Kremlin's narrative, such as members of parliament like Yeramayv. Today it was one man who was harshly censored but had the courage to stand up and speak. Tomorrow, after yet more humiliation for Russia, it could be more. The Ukraine war is lost and dissent is brewing. All Putin can hope for now is that he outlasts that dissent before the invasion he started crumbles around him. Putin isn't going to be getting any help from Ukraine. As Russia's parliament turns against him, Ukraine has unveiled a genius strategy that's going to end Putin's war. The kill zones are breaking records. It's only going to get worse for Russia from here on out. Find out more in our video. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to The Military Show to catch the latest news from inside Russia that mainstream media doesn't report. And thank you as always for watching.